Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Wednesday, November 15th, and welcome to our video commentary. Ever since President Obama opened an embassy in Cuba, or the United States opened an embassy in Cuba based on the new Obama policy toward Cuba, there's been a lot of talk about tourists going to Cuba and people going to Cuba. And there have been, in fact, many people who have gone to Cuba to see it. But over the last few months, we've been reading stories of American airline companies actually cutting back their flights. And they basically say there's no demand for going to Cuba, or certainly not as much demand or as many seats as they thought they would sell. This week, Alaska Airlines, which is one of the airlines that would fly from LA to Havana, decided to terminate their flights. This is on top of American Airlines and as well as a few others who've come back significantly, if not eliminated their flights to Cuba. So what's going on? Obviously, an easy response would be to say that President Trump's new policy toward Cuba has had this impact. I don't think that's the problem at all. Now, there's no question that President Trump taking our policy sort of back to a pre-Obama policy will have an impact because the embargo will be enforced more than it was under President Obama. But I think the real reason behind this is that Cuba is not much of a tourism destination. The average American goes on vacation because they want to see a country. They go on vacation because they want to have a good time. You go to Cancun, you go to Bahamas, you go wherever you go because you want to have a good time. You go on vacation and you want to go to a fun place where you can go to the beach and have a good time. Other tourists like to travel around the country, see some things for themselves, and so on. The problem with Cuba is that Cuba has a very bad infrastructure for any of that. And that's because Cuba has not really invested in a lot of hotels or a lot of tourism centers. And as a consequence, they can no longer compete with other facilities in the Caribbean, whether it's Cancun, whether it's Jamaica, whether it's some of the many other facilities in the Caribbean who compete for American tourists. American tourists are obviously very demanding as to where they go. They want to go somewhere where they can get the best for their dollar. And Cuba is not such a location. Now, if you can stay in a very good hotel in Cuba, I understand that. But what Cuba doesn't have is what I would call the middle ground, where you can actually go to a hotel, let's say, that is not a top-rated hotel, or whether you can rent a car and travel around the island, where you can get around. Cuba just doesn't have that infrastructure because it never really developed it in the past, or certainly not during the Castro years. Well, I think that's what's happening. A lot of tourists are going to Cuba. They get to see Cuba. They can come back and they say, well, I saw Cuba. What did you think of Cuba? Not much. Not much there to see. It kind of reminds me of a few Mexican friends who've always told me they go to Cuba because it's so cheap. And it is. Cuba is relatively cheap compared to some of the other destinations, particularly for Latin American tourists. So they go to Cuba, they don't spend a lot of money, and then when they come out, all they do is complain about the infrastructure, the hotel service is bad, the food is not good, and so on and so on. So the bottom line is that Cuba is not ready to be a tourism destination. And it's not going to be ready until they have a change of government, so that you can once have a government in place that actually will develop these tourist locations for the benefit of the tourists, for the benefit of the Cubans who work in these places. What you have right now is a Cuban government who uses tourism to enrich itself, to put money in its own pockets. And it doesn't really do anything to make Cuba more attractive for the American tourist. So I'm not surprised that companies are cutting back. I think you'll see others cut back. And it'll probably go on for a while until there's a change of government and something positive can happen in Cuba. Thank you for watching. We have these commentaries over at YouTube. We also have them over at Twitter, and we also have them over at my blog. Have a good day, everybody.